I think we're live. Hi, everyone. Hi, Felicia.
Hello.
Thank you for being patient while I set up all of our technology.
No problem.
The least fun part. So I see people are trickling in. I'm super excited with everyone who has joined. Welcome to our discussion on imposter syndrome, women in tech, and the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I see a lot of people who are new to Work Bigger. So I'll introduce myself in a minute. But before we get to all of that, just want to get some logistical stuff out of the way. We're recording this call, and after we record it, I'm going to share it on our website, workbigger.co. So if you want to revisit it, you're welcome to. I'll also send out an email. We're also streaming this on Facebook Live for the Work Bigger community. So you may see me toggling back and forth, checking any comments on there. And I want to call out that we like to keep these calls as interactive as possible. So share a question in the chat or in the Q&A box. And we'll either, do Q&A throughout the call. We'll see how things go. I really like to I like to go with the flow and just not have these be super formal interviews. So I'll be checking in the chat box, the Q&A, and the Facebook Live chat. If you're watching on Facebook, give us a like or a heart. I really love hearing from our community members, and I get super excited whenever I see likes and hearts. They make me super happy. And those of you who are new to Work Bigger, I'd love to hear just how you heard about this call and also where you're calling from. So just leave it in the comments. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. So I'm Belma. I'm the CEO and founder of Work Bigger. Work Bigger is a career development platform with a mission to redefine work. And what we're doing here is we help people do work they love that helps make a difference in the world without burning out. And we do that through community and coaching. We work with a lot of individuals who are feeling really stuck in their careers. They don't know what it is they want to do, what their long-term vision or mission is. We also work with people who are trying to get their side hustles off the ground or looking for a new job. On the other side of that, we work with companies in luxury retail, media, tech, finance to support with employee engagement and retention. We do a lot of conversations around topics like unconscious bias, women in tech, female sexuality, spirituality, anything that really helps us work from a more conscious place, which is why we're hosting this discussion today with Felicia Jadczak from She Geeks Out. She Geeks Out is an incredible community that supports women in tech. I'm going to let Felicia introduce herself, but just so excited to have you here, Felicia. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here as well. So I'll give a really quick intro of myself and She Geeks Out, and I'm sure we'll get further into it as we do the discussion today. She Geeks Out is a startup based out of Boston. We are basically, the way I like to say it is we have two sides to our company. On our community side, we hold different events for tech and tech-adjacent women and their allies. And what this means is in Boston, we hold usually 2 to 3 events a month where these events are really designed to bring people together on both personal as well as professional levels. We're creating a community where people can connect and engage in person as well as online. And we're also connecting these people with companies who want to, quite frankly, hire them and support them within their organizations. We also have communities in New York as well as San Francisco. In New York and San Francisco, we tend to do about 1 event a month. So those are newer areas for us, but we've been in Boston since 2013 and really excited about growing just awesome, cool, nerdy, geeky people. On the other side of the house, we run diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and workshops for companies and organizations of all shapes and sizes. Most of our trainings are in person, although we're sort of foraying into online courses this year. So that's something that's new for us, which we can definitely talk about later. But
that's exciting.
Yeah, it is very exciting. It's also a lot more work than you might think it would be. Not just about copying and pasting and throwing something up online. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
But our workshops are really designed to kind of answer okay, great. So you've hired in these people from whether they're women or people who are from underrepresented groups into your company, but are you actually supporting them? And are you creating a really inclusive culture? And also, how are you hiring in people and where are you looking for people? And so we work with companies to figure out answers to those questions. So our trainings are not just educational, but very tangible and action oriented. And I like to say that we're really trying to help people move the needle so that we can get to a better place on both ends of the spectrum, whether it's on the individual employee standpoint or on the company organizational level.
Amazing, amazing. I'm really excited to dig a little bit deeper on the work you're doing around DEI. And before we get to that, I'd love to hear what got you to even focus on diversity and inclusion and to support women in tech.
Yeah, so it actually stemmed from my previous job before I joined She Geeks Out full time. So I've been working in tech my entire career, which was purely accidental because I went to school for English and French literature and tried to skate by with taking 0 tech or science related classes. But I ended up getting a job in tech after I graduated and just basically found myself growing my career within this industry and have grown to really love it. In a previous role at a company called VMware, which is headquartered out in the Bay Area but has locations all over the world, I was working for their CTO's office as a program manager, working on what they called innovation programs. And one of those innovation programs was actually developing out, growing, and supporting their very first employee resource group for their female software engineers back in 2012. So this was still what I like to call the Wild West of tech companies starting to think about diversity at all. And a lot of companies were starting with thinking about gender diversity and not even thinking about the broader spectrum. And so I was assigned to start this program, and I really didn't know much about any of these topics myself, but there was no real best practices to follow. There were no guidelines, no rules. And so I just started doing the research myself and reading the research papers and reaching out to people in the field and really learning a lot on my own so that I could really support this community internally to VMware. That's how I actually got started with running and facilitating some trainings, because I started working with groups like the internal recruiting and staffing teams and talking to them about, hey, maybe we should think about what words we're using when we're putting our job descriptions together. And maybe we shouldn't talk about rock stars and ninjas and, hoodies and ping pong. And maybe we should talk about other things when we're trying to reach more women. And that's how I started personally getting involved in that. And I'll be quite honest, I actually resisted it for a very long time because I, up to that point, had been growing my career in tech. I was a woman in tech. I had gone to graduate school for an MBA as well as a technical master's in information systems. And my fear was that by starting to get into the diversity space, into the gender space specifically at that point, I would be labeled as fluffy and non-technical. And to be really honest, that's what happened. But the flip side of it was that it became my passion, and I'm sure we'll get into this further, but really why I'm so passionate about, women in tech and what that definition is and how we're supporting each other, because I really saw that if I had stayed within this large corporate structure, I was already getting put on different projects that were not technical, that, were leading me in a different pathway. And I tried really hard to not have that happen, but then ultimately succumbed and obviously started She Geeks Out, and I'm really deep in it now.
Yeah. I love that you shared the resistance you felt around moving to this type of work. I have my own opinions around why, I think traditionally, even, like Work Bigger, we do leadership development, right? And we support companies with employee engagement and retention, and we work with learning and development teams, and we focus on coaching. And all of that is also seen traditionally as fluffy. Mm-hmm. Right? Why do you, and I have, my own opinions around why I feel that is, but why do you think that is? Like, why do you think this work that is so important and fundamental to business success isn't valued right off the bat?
I think it really speaks to like a larger systemic issue, to be quite honest. I remember when I started business school, took all the standard classes, finance, accounting, whatnot, and we did have an organizational behavior class, but unlike any of the other standard classes that we had to take our first year, it was a shortened version, and I forget how long it was actually, but it was maybe a 6-week class as opposed to a semester-long class. And I, looking back, have always thought that's such a missed opportunity because whether I've worked at large or small companies or in startups, the biggest skills that I've drawn on in my life and my career have been relationship building, have been personal interactions, have been understanding how to work on teams with other people who don't work or think like you. And those are the skills and things that you talk about in classes like organizational behavior, in practices like that. And I think when people start thinking about diversity and inclusion, sometimes it gets lumped into this fluffy bucket because we're not thinking about it as a core business strength. And there's a redefining that needs to happen. It makes me think a lot of the changes over time that have happened, especially when you look at what's happened in the field of computer science, where in the 70s and 80s, it was very heavily dominated by women. And then as people started realizing this is a field where you can make a lot of money and you can get a lot of success, and men started coming in and really taking over. And now that has been redefined as this is a man's world, and we see that there's the pipeline problems, and there's a lot of efforts obviously out there trying to get more women and girls into STEM and coding, but that wasn't the case in the 80s. And so I think it's really about how are we talking about these skills and how are we prioritizing certain skills over others. I'll tell you right now, the skills that I learned in business school from, learning how to read a finance statement and accounting, I don't need to know that because guess what? I'm a CEO, but I have an accountant, and I have people who do my taxes for me, and I have finance people who we hire to dig into all that, and they love it, and that's great. But that's not part of my job, and it's good that I understand how that works, but I don't actually get into that every day. But what I do get into every day is this relationship building, is understanding how to manage people, is understanding how to negotiate with people. And those are skills that honestly, I really wish if I could sort of have a do-over, that I would be able to prioritize and highlight more. But when I was going through that experience, it wasn't seen as important. Mm-hmm. And I'm just using business school as one example of this. And certainly not everyone who is a founder or who is in a company or, is in the startup world goes through business school. Well, that's my personal experience. And so there's other areas too where we can see this kind of coming out. But, a lot of times in the corporate world, especially if we're talking about tech, we see when women start to progress in their careers and start to move up the different career ladders and get shifted into different pathways, you'll see statements, or you'll hear statements rather, like, oh, you're so organized, so you'd be really great at being a PM. Well, guess what? Maybe this woman would be really great at continuing to be an engineer, and she just happens to be organized. But organizational skills are not something that necessarily are unique to women or can't be learned. And so there's this underlying narrative that I think we have to start speaking up about and shifting that.
Yeah. And I think what you're referring to also, I mean, you're clearly using your core strengths as a CEO, right? And that's not finance. It's all of the stuff that you need as a CEO to move the business forward. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree more. I wish there was more of an emphasis, I also went to business school. I think even before business school, just throughout very early on in our education, I wish there was more emphasis on the relationship building, on skills that build connection, right? Because I think what you're doing too around building community is really about fostering connection and making an impact versus, the technical skills are important too, but yeah. I'd love to say that again.
I said you need both.
Yeah, exactly. I'd love to talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing with companies. So I attended one of your unconscious bias workshops, and it was incredible. And for everyone watching, whether you're in New York, Boston, I think people are calling from all over, but I highly recommend attending a She Geeks Out event. This was, I think, in partnership with Tech Ladies, and it was on unconscious bias, and it was really incredible. So can you share just a little bit, like some of the work that you're doing with companies, what you're educating them on, and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So we have what I like to call a pre-built library of workshops that we've developed over the last couple of years. One of the foundational workshops is that unconscious bias in the workplace that you were able to attend, which was really great. And thank you for your kind words, by the way.
Yeah.
But we also have a number of different other offerings. We do some longer form workshops, which focus more specifically on recruiting for a more diverse workforce and how to recruit inclusively. We do some work around retention and creating an inclusive culture where we talk about not only manager skills through the lens of diversity and inclusion. So, we're not coming in and necessarily teaching you how to be a manager, but saying, let's look at what the different pieces are of being a manager with this in mind. So, as you're running your team meetings, how do you run more inclusive team meetings to make sure everyone's included? If you are going through that promotion process, how are you making sure that you're standardizing it and making sure that you're not treating people differently because you might have gone out to beers with some of the guys on your team versus some other people. So we sort of look at everything through this lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, as we like to call it. And then we also dig deeper into certain topics like recognizing and responding to microaggressions. So that relates more to our interpersonal interactions with each other. And we connect that sometimes to other topics like allyship. How do you be an ally in the workplace? And then finally, we wrap up with what we call the Vault, which is our advanced program, which is a small cohort program designed to really allow people to dig into having difficult conversations around DEI in the workplace. And it's usually either a whole day where you just dive really deeply into this, or a cohort series over a series of a couple weeks. But as I mentioned, we have this library of workshops, and we work with a number of different companies to really make sure that we're making these trainings very specific to their needs. And so nothing is ever force-fed down someone's throat, but whether it's using different vocabulary or language or even specific scenarios that have come up within a company, we make sure that we're really speaking to each individual organization and where they're coming from. A lot of times when I talk about this topic, we talk about being on a journey, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And this is true for individuals, but also true for organizations. And if you think about organizational culture, it is also a living, growing thing, and it can shift over time. But we also know that organizational culture takes a really long time to shift. And so we need to basically meet people as well as organizations where they're at. And if someone's never talked about unconscious bias before, then we have to start from the very beginning. If a company or an organization is a little bit more advanced in terms of who's part of their company or what they've done, then we can treat that process a little bit differently. But really, going back to the workshops themselves, the idea for me is that what I love about it is that we're pairing education and awareness with tangible action items that you can take back to your workplace. And everything is presented in the context of work, because certainly a lot of this is very personal, but we're really trying to figure out, okay, things that you might be talking about have a very different meaning and sense if you're at home with your family versus if you're talking about how are your power dynamics between you and your manager or in the team setting. And that can be very complicated. And so we really try to make sure that we're not just teaching people, but we're answering that question of, okay, great, I learned about bias, but now what do I do? Mm-hmm. And so we're really trying to make sure that we give people tools and tips and tricks so that they can say, okay, I have a couple things that I know next time I go into an interview. Like I have some things I know what to do, or next time the situation comes up, I know what I can refer back to. And that's really the goal for the trainings that we do.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. One of the things that you hit on at the workshop, or that I picked up on, is this fear that we have when we're talking about unconscious bias, right? And fear of getting it wrong. You did this for everyone watching. Felicia did this exercise where she invited everybody to make assumptions about you, right? And we had to assume what your nationality was and what your religion was. And I was looking around the room, and I actually saw some people weren't even answering some of the questions because there's this fear of, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to be offensive, right? So Can you talk a little bit about that and what you see and, what we can do to get past that so that we can, there could be change and impact versus feeling stuck in our own fear, right?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. I actually, this exercise, we call it Who Is, and usually it's who is whatever the facilitator name is. So who is Felicia? And it's so interesting because the reason why I love doing this exercise is not because I want everyone to, learn everything about me, but as you said, I'm inviting people to make assumptions, and usually there's always at least one person who gets really uncomfortable with this because they're like, well, I don't know you. And my answer is always, yes, that's exactly the point, because no matter who we are, if we're walking down the street, if we're in a training, if we're on this webinar, if we're whatever we're doing, we're interacting with people and we're making these really quick snap judgments about people without even realizing it sometimes. And so a lot of times when we're asked to step back and actually examine these judgments and these assumptions and perhaps even stereotypes that we are having occur within us, that can make us feel uncomfortable. And this brings me to another point, which I also like to bring up in this particular workshop especially, which is that everyone is biased, and that's okay. It's not about whether bias is bad or good. It's just about recognizing it. But a lot of times we're so socialized to automatically assume that if we're making an assumption or if we have a bias, that that's a really bad negative thing. And so I'm trying to, again, rewrite this narrative where it's not about saying you're a bad person if you thought I was, Pakistani and I'm not, or if you thought I was Middle Eastern, I'm not, but like whatever the assumptions are, it's not about whether it's bad. It's just about understanding that we're all really complex, multi-layered people. And, especially I know a lot of times in this area, we're talking a lot these days about concepts like intersectionality. We all have these multiple identity groups that are can be very complex. And so we can't just look at someone and say, here you are, I know everything about you. And so to this feeling of fear and discomfort that you mentioned that people sometimes experience, again, a lot of times we try very hard as human beings to not ever feel fear or discomfort. But there's a really big difference between feeling discomfort because something is new or different or outside of the realm of our experience and being in real actual danger. And so part of this exercise is designed to actually have people feel that, because no one is in danger. Nothing bad is going to happen if they make a wrong assumption. I have invited people to make these assumptions about me, as you said, and so it's not some random person who's being put on the spot. And I've decided what statements I'm actually asking people to go through, and I'm choosing which ones I'm having people decide about me. And so there's no repercussions there. So it's a safe environment. And so that is kind of basically trying to help people start to learn what that feeling is and saying, okay, this is feeling weird and uncomfortable, but I'm okay. And so the next time that they might find themselves in a situation, maybe at work, maybe not, where they might be questioning their judgment or having something come up that's related to these topics, and they might be feeling that fear, they could, hopefully, my hope is that they can then flash back to something like this training and say, okay, I'm not in danger. I'm not going to make a decision that's going to wreck everything or, anything like that. But why am I feeling this way? And where is this feeling stemming from? And let me maybe sit in this feeling of discomfort for a little bit and examine what's going on there. I think we may have talked about this at the workshop you went to, Belma, but I dig into some of these different cognitive biases, and one of them that we talk about quite a lot is affinity bias. And affinity bias is when you connect really well with people who are like you, whether that's, someone who's the same ethnicity or went to the same high school or likes the same TV shows that you do, whatever it is, that point of connection. And you see this all the time when you're looking at things like team dynamics or recruiting, where, let's say you're interviewing someone and you're like, oh, this person's great. Like they went to the same college as I did, so they're going to be great at this role. And you have this affinity bias. And it's not about whether that's good or bad, but it's about saying, okay, if you have interviewed a candidate and you're like, well, I don't really know if they would super fit in because I didn't really get a super great vibe from them. Maybe take a step back and examine, what is that feeling? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from the fact that maybe they didn't answer the questions in the right way, or there were some red flags with, a technical answer or whatever it might be? Or is it stemming from the fact that you have no points of connection with them? And so, you
Which
don't.
is, yeah, and I think that's so important from a leadership perspective, because if we're hiring people who are just like us too, I mean, obviously you do this work, but it's just not, the bias is bad, but also when it comes to the goals and achieving business goals, it's not as effective, right? And I think that's also one reason why you're doing this work.
Yeah. It's, my goal is to really, I have a lot of experience feeling like the odd person out, or like the other, or the token person in a situation. And, I still have had a great career. I've really enjoyed my time working. I'm loving what I'm doing right now. But I think what I do right now is particularly meaningful and impactful on both ends of what we do on the training side, because of exactly this, where, if I can even reach one person who then takes a second to think, okay, why am I thinking this way the next time they're in a situation, like that has so many ripple effects that can spread really wide. And on the community side, when we, let's say we have a company that we might have done a training with, or who's done their own work and has now hired in people who come to events like ours, being able to make those connections and really, this sounds really hokey, but change people's lives is super meaningful. And I just love it. Like every time someone says, oh, like I hired this person at your event, or, I met this woman and then I connected her to this other organization and now she got a job here. Like it just really is so wonderful for me. And same thing goes with when I talk with people who've gone to trainings and they're like, oh, I always think about this thing that you brought up, and we changed our job description so that we don't say XYZ. Like that is so awesome and super impactful.
Yeah, I would love to hear what questions are coming up from everyone who's watching around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So everyone watching, please feel free to share a question, to share a comment. I'm going to direct the conversation now on imposter syndrome, because we've had a lot of people sign up for this topic. I think imposter syndrome is a big one. More and more people are starting to open up about it, which I think is so important, because it takes away that shame of, I have imposter syndrome. We all have it. Felicia, so can you share a little bit about your own experience with imposter syndrome?
Definitely. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about my background. And so having jumped into tech with having no tech background at all, no STEM experience really, I essentially always felt imposter syndrome from the very beginning without even knowing that it had a name or a label for that feeling. And it wasn't until I was a little bit later in my career where I started to hear imposter syndrome being talked about. And really when I was working at VMware and I started doing this work with our female software engineers, I started to really see this come out quite a bit more. On my own personal level, given my educational background and sort of how I came into the field, I always never really quite felt like I belonged. And I always felt like I was faking it, and that at some point in my life, I would get found out and exposed for being not great and, kind of like living this lie. And it was just this sort of very pervasive feeling where I would go to work and just be like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea why I'm here. Why did they pick me? And a lot of this was tied into as well, not being able to really consider myself a woman in tech. And so I really had like a light bulb moment when it came to this whole feeling and experience for me. And I was at a Unix conference it's quite a few years ago now. And they had a separate women's summit as part of the conference. And there was a speaker there who worked for Google, and she was very senior. She basically ran Gmail, and she was speaking. And first she was super nervous, and I couldn't understand why she was so nervous, because she was so highly qualified. And I was like, you should just you basically built our email systems. Like, you know everything about this. You should just be up there telling us all these things. And I was really surprised to see how visibly like nervous and shaking she was. And she shared about her own feelings of imposter syndrome and how she always felt like she was this fraud and she would always get caught out, especially as she kept moving up the ladder. And, she had a much more quote unquote traditional career path within tech, where she had gone to college. She had, gone to school for computer science. She had sort of followed this much more standard path than someone like me. And as I was listening to her share her experiences, like this light bulb went off where I was like, oh, like if someone like her, who is so clearly belongs here and is a woman in tech, like feels these feelings, like I'm not alone and I'm not the anomaly. And it really made me think, okay, dummy, like you are literally a woman and you work in tech. So you are literally a woman in tech. And, and it's so funny because I mentioned I went to grad school. I had this MBA, I had the master's in information systems, and especially post-grad school, no one cared about my MBA and everyone only really cared about my master's in information systems. And I was like, you got it. Like you're qualified, you're doing the job. Like your manager loves you. Like, why are you sabotaging yourself with these feelings? And so I really made this very conscious decision to kind of like rewire my brain a little bit. And so every time I would feel these feelings of inadequacy come up, I just sort of shove it aside and just be like, you know what, I'm awesome. Like I'm the most amazing woman in tech. And, it's one of those things where it's sort of like, if anyone knows like the power posing and like, you have a mantra that you can tell yourself, like the more you say it, the more you believe it, the more it actually starts to be your reality. And, when I started having people come up to me at the company at VMware, and this was a 20,000 person company at that point, and people knew me and they would come up to me. And I still remember this one woman, what she said to me, because it was one of the most amazing compliments I ever received in my life, still to date. And she was like, Felicia, when I think of women in tech, I think of you as the example. And I was just like, thank you, because even though I'm like rewriting this narrative in my own head and just putting myself out there and saying, you know what, like I'm an amazing woman in tech, deal with it, I still have these feelings of doubt. Like, it's something that's probably never going to go away, but it's something that a lot of people struggle with. And the more I worked with, this female software group and with just even general people in my organization, in my industry, I started seeing that it wasn't just women. Imposter syndrome is not exclusively a woman's issue. It's something that happens for everybody. I remember talking to a very senior software architect at VMware who was a man, and he was expressing basically feelings of imposter syndrome. And I said to him, hey, you're experiencing imposter syndrome. And he'd never heard of the term before, but I was like, you of all people. And it just started making me realize that it's a very pervasive thing and it's very normal in a sense that a lot of people experience this. So yeah, it's something that, it's not like you can cure yourself necessarily, but I think there are ways you can mitigate it.
Yeah, this conversation, I was speaking with a friend of mine yesterday. She has 2 or 3 businesses, like a very successful underwear line. And she said to me, I feel exhausted, like from the self-doubt. And I think, whether like self-doubt, imposter syndrome, it's really draining. And I think it's, to your point, you can't really make it go away, but you almost have to learn to coexist with it and really focus on the other side. Where do you feel like it stems from, these feelings? And I agree with you. I think both men and women experience it. I think when you're a woman in a male-dominated environment, it's almost exacerbated because you don't have the support and the resources that you may need, right, to overcome just the systemic bias that exists. But just curious from your perspective, where do you think imposter syndrome comes from?
I think it definitely relates to a lot of what you just said, having anxieties in general. And then especially if you're in a field where you're not, sort of the norm, or you're a minority in whatever sense that is, or you're having to prove something. because of external forces, like that can just sort of build and build and build. You know, and I think, again, it stems also back to just this societal narrative of, you know, we're still, like, we've made a lot of progress, but we're still dealing with getting girls into these STEM fields and saying, you know, girls can code just as well as boys, and, you know, and these are not male exclusive things. And I think just having that external narrative still being very much an issue, is part of it. You know, we, especially given the work that I do, you know, I think and talk a lot about things like media influences. You know, if you look at what the television shows are, and you look at, you know, who is portraying the different roles. And, you know, we've had some strides in recent years. So we've had movies like Hidden Figures come out, which was amazing. But still, like, when you go into classrooms and you ask little kids to draw pictures of like doctors and scientists and lawyers, like, a lot of times they're still defaulting to men. And, you know, and this is something that's just so deeply socialized within us. Like, I'll share a really quick example that is much more recent from my own experience. I work out of a co-working space in Boston, and I was chatting with a guy who is at a different company, and he was like, oh, you know, I see you have an event coming up in Boston. I'm going to get my CEO to go. And I was like, well, just so you know, our events are women only. And he responded, yeah, my CEO is a woman. And that was my knee-jerk reaction. This happened a couple months ago, you know, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I'm sharing it because, like, I think about this stuff all the time, and it's something that I do too. Like, I default to these expectations and these norms because I'm a product of this society. I've been raised in this world, and as much as I am very aware of a lot of this stuff, you know, my brain just instinctively goes to that. Now, you know, my hope and what I, you know, am trying to do is, next time I'm in a situation like that, perhaps think back to that experience, so I don't necessarily knee jerk and say, oh, you know, your CEO must be a guy, and say, you know, what gender is your CEO, or, you know, figure something out that way. But, like, it's so commonplace. And so I think tying it back to imposter syndrome, you know, like, just when we're in this world that we live in, and we have all these messages and stuff, and we're trying to kind of chart a new story, it can be really hard because we always feel like we're alone, or, you know, we're not doing it right, or, you know, a lot of guys are really confident about stuff. And you know what, like, sometimes doing a job is mostly confidence and being like, hey, you know, this is the right way, even if it's not. And you know, sometimes we just aren't trained to kind of think that way. You know, even as a startup CEO, like, I'll share, we are a small startup. We've been around so we've been running events since 2013, but my business partner and I formed our company in 2015. So we've been around for a couple years now, but we are not this typical startup story because we don't have any outside investor funding. We don't have any VC funding, and we're two women founders. And so, you know, a lot of times we sort of don't get talked about when Boston talks about the startup scene, or, you know, talks about different companies. And that can feel very anxiety inducing sometimes. It's like, are we not doing a good job? You know, we can't play with the people in the big leagues. And I still remember there was a woman who had emailed us a year ago, and she emailed us about something for female founders, and was like, oh, we have this program for female founders. Can you spread the word? Do you know anyone who might be interested in applying? And we wrote back to her and we were like, well, we're female founders. And she wrote back and was like, oh, I always forget because you're so organized and you have your shit together. And
Wow.
it was so crazy, you know? And so if you're, like, dealing with stuff like this, and again, this is a woman saying this to us, and she was a personal friend and had worked with us and was friendly with us and still didn't see us as startup founders, it can be challenging. And so a lot of it is just really trying to go back to your support system. You know, I have some friends in my life who really just, like, are amazing champions who will just, like, continually pump me up and build me up and tell me I'm awesome. And that's super helpful because you definitely have your days where, you know, you're like, I'm dumb. I'm not doing anything right. This is a big mistake. People, how do we even get here? Like, it's going to come crumbling down, you know? And
Yeah.
totally normal. It happens. So.
Well, I think it's exactly to your point. It's women feel it more because the messages we're getting externally sort of validate the negative feelings we're experiencing. So we're leaning more towards the negative, right? Whether you're a man or a woman, you experience both the confident feelings, but you also experience the imposter syndrome. But with the messages we're receiving externally, we're getting validation on the negative unconsciously. So I think just shining awareness around that is hopefully just, and thank you, by the way, for sharing that story. I think that's so powerful and important to share because, again, it takes away the shame that we're not perfect. We're not going to do this perfectly. The point is really to get better at it, right? And that's really where we see impact. And somebody said, man or woman aren't the only two options. Yes, and thank you for that. I for correcting me. I appreciate it. I'm seeing some questions come in through the community, so I'm going to read them if that's okay. Celia says, have you been able to identify what your triggers are for self-doubt? How do you try to manage those?
Oh my gosh, I probably have so many. Yeah, I think the self-doubt just comes from just feeling really overwhelmed, and I will say, in the spirit of being pretty vulnerable, especially given this conversation, there's some things that I do to manage all of basically everything, which I find critical and super helpful. So one is that I see a personal therapist every week, and I've been doing it essentially since I left my full-time job to do She Geeks Out full-time. Just it's so helpful because it's not just for my personal life, but I talk a lot about my business and what's going on in therapy. And I have a co-founder, an amazing woman named Rachel Murray, and she and I work together super closely. We've been working together since 2013. She probably is the person outside my own family who knows me the best out of anyone in this entire world. But it's a relationship, and just like any romantic relationship or familial relationship, like we have our ups and downs and we butt heads, and and especially being a really small startup, there's no other place to go. We don't have HR, we don't have a larger team to absorb things, and so therapy has been really helpful for me if I'm feeling these imposter syndrome feelings, if I'm feeling doubt, if I'm feeling overwhelmed. I also, as I said, have a couple really core close friends who I reach out to have them pump me up, or to share how I'm feeling, or to even just provide a different perspective, or even just hear what their lives are like, because especially as a startup founder, work is 24/7, and that's another really big challenge for me. And sometimes that ties into these feelings of imposter syndrome, because it feels like no matter how much you work, you're just continually working, and you're never going to get through that to-do list or, get a handle on everything. And that's been a really difficult realization for me, because I'm a very big list person, and I love nothing more than checking every single thing off my list and crossing off that last item and being like, and that has never happened. So that's been something I've worked really hard, or I will say I'm still working really hard on coming to terms with that realization that I'll never get done. It's such a hard thing to deal with, but just trying to be very intentional about taking time for myself and putting limits on things like, I work on the weekends a lot because I have to for certain things, but saying, for Saturday or Sunday or Sunday night, whatever it is, like saying no email time, like this is my time, because I'm not going to be able to do a good job if I can't function and be a well-rested whole person. Taking vacation time, taking personal days, spending time with loved ones, even if it just means booking time on my calendar so I can watch trashy TV. Like, that's important. And of course, I can't book out a whole week to watch trashy TV because that's not feasible, but really trying to have a balance there and not guilt myself for having to do that, because the pressure is really from internally. It's not from anyone else.
And I love what you shared about therapy. I think it's so important to find support. We're at a point in the world where things are shifting so much, and there is I mean, I think I see so many people wanting to do more, to reach their full potential, to go out there and do work that feels really meaningful to them. And I think that's incredible. But with that, right, comes all of the emotional triggers and the mental triggers, and a lot of stuff from our past resurfaces when you're growing and challenging yourself. And I think it's so important to find resources to help you through that so that you're not going through it alone, right? Whether it's therapy, community, coaching, whatever, it doesn't matter what, a group of friends, accountability groups. I just think it's so necessary, because then you're kind of standing on your own, feeling all isolated with your feelings and emotions, and you don't know, you kind of get stuck in them. So I think and then the self-care rituals that you mentioned too, I think are critical. I'm going to read a couple of other questions that are coming in. Thank you guys. I love hearing from you all and all these questions. They're awesome. Jan says, thank you for your sharings on imposter syndrome. I definitely think everyone can relate in some way or another. I myself have just moved cities and trying to make a career move into tech from a non-technical background. And the difficulty of the job search is making my imposter syndrome worse. Yeah, I hear you. The job search is so demoralizing too sometimes. Do you have any advice on overcoming these feelings, and how can I convince myself that my previous experience counts?
Yeah, it's first of all, good luck, because like Belma said, the job search process is challenging and demoralizing. I would say, try to reach out to, it sounds like you said you just moved cities as well as trying to break into a new job. So there's probably a lot of stuff going on for you. I would recommend trying to reach out to community, like local communities, whether it's in whatever, if there's I'm not sure exactly what kind of tech role you're looking for, but if there's like a programming language or a group like Geeks Out, or there's a whole bunch of other really awesome groups in different areas of the country, because sharing that with other people who can either connect you to roles or who can help you sort of build yourself up so that you don't get overcome with these feelings can be really helpful. I will tell you, so I went through a whole job search process before I left my last company to do She Geeks Out, and it was really depressing because I got one offer and it was not a good offer in a sense that it wasn't a good fit. And I kind of knew that as I was going through the interview process, but I was just like, let's just see what happens. And when I got the offer, I was like, it doesn't make sense for me to do this to myself. And, and I sent out all these applications and had a bunch of interviews and no one wanted me. And meanwhile, at my actual job, I was getting promotions and bonuses and people were like, you're an amazing, performer. And I ultimately ended up leaving to start my own company. I don't think that's necessarily the answer for everyone, but that was the answer for me. And I would just say, really try to just reach out to your support system. If you need to make a new support system to work on that as well, because I was just actually talking about this last night. One of the biggest ways people still get jobs is through networking and their networks. And, maybe it's starting to do like informational interviews and reaching out to either people who are at companies that you're interested in or people who have done similar transitions and asking them how did they go about it, what worked for them. I think the nice thing going for you right now is that tech is really trying to hire a lot of people, and there's a war for talent, and I think that tech companies are starting to realize that they have to look outside this traditional candidate pathway, and so they are looking more and more at non-traditional candidates, like it sounds like you are. So I think that it's not impossible, but just about figuring out, especially if you're breaking into tech, how to really pitch yourself in a great way, how to package your approach, and if there's buzzwords or things that you can be doing to just make it, a better option as far as candidacy goes. But yeah,
and I'll add to that too. I think it's really helpful to make your skills transferable. So before we talked about the soft skills, we really need a new name for that. And the hard skills, right? So depending on the job roles that you had previously and that you're applying for now, I think calling things out, maybe like relationship building, whatever it was, all of that stuff is transferable, right? And it's all about how you add value to the company and thinking a little bit big picture. So I always like to think about what are the pain points that this company is experiencing and how can I help them meet those pain points, right? And then connecting the dots, making your previous skills transferable. And we have some content too on the Work Bigger site that might help you. We did do an article on this, just basically like taking your resume, if it's non-technical, and then how to translate it to a new role. So you might want to check out the website. Sarah says, what have you seen as the key motivators for large companies interested in your diversity workshops? Have you been asked about ROI much?
Yeah, definitely ROI is return on investment for anyone who's not familiar, is a big factor. I would say it's really interesting because a lot of time, well, I will say like about half of the time when we work with large companies for training, it's reactionary. So if something has happened internally, an incident, a situation, something's happened and they're sort of scrambling and they're like, okay, we got to find someone to sort of deal with this and like mop up the mess. The other half of the time with large companies, they're, especially in tech, I would say not all of our clients are in the tech industry, but quite a bit, a high percentage are in tech. Large companies in tech, it's, a lot of companies are just focused on growth. And so they grow, they grow really large. And then they're like, oh, okay, now let's think about diversity. And, it's such a struggle because the time to think about it is at the beginning, but a lot of times that's when companies don't have the resources or the time or the money to really invest in things like that, or even the awareness, and so what happens is you grow and then you might be growing a toxic culture as you grow. And then you start to realize, okay, we need to address some stuff here. And so I would say for the companies that are larger that are not reacting to some situation, they're just sort of able to catch their breath and say, okay, we figured out the product, we've got the people, we now have time to actually think about how do we really want to long-term strategically plan. And they are absolutely looking at diversity as a business bottom line metric. And a lot of these clients of ours ask us to really highlight that in the training, especially if there are people in the training who are not super on board or bought into it, because that's how you can reach some people. Is not about, this is a good thing to do as a human being, or it's a good thing to do in general, but here's why diversity is important from a business bottom line standpoint.
Thank you for that. What else? What other questions do you guys have? Someone said they love the junk TV piece that you mentioned. It's really important just to give yourself a break from emotional and mental labor. And then we have some comments and questions coming in through our Facebook Live in the Work Bigger community. Leah says, I love that you note coexistence with your feelings, identifying that your feelings come and go. So this is going back to the imposter syndrome, but you are not your feelings. You just have to exist alongside of them. This could be a deep topic in and of itself. That's really powerful. Thank you, Leah, for sharing that. Does anything come up for you, Felicia, as I share that comment?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. Feelings definitely come and go. And honestly, most of the time, if I'm feeling something very strong, especially if it's negative, what I've learned is to just sort of sit with it. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier about sitting with the discomfort from a slightly different angle, but to the point of what you're saying, sometimes this is temporary and it'll pass. And so I sort of sit with it. I'm like, okay, I might want to kill this person right now, really, but like, I'm probably, like I need to just sort of tamp it down and come back to that later. And so this is also something that's a little bit not super technical, but I've also found a really effective tool for me has been journaling. And so I try to journal about stuff like that. Yeah. And I again, this is sort of like where my own imposter syndrome flares up, because my instinctive reaction to even saying that is I want to sort of downplay this and be like, oh, it's so fluffy and stupid. But it actually is a really powerful tool that I have been using off and on for years now. And it's not only nice to be able to like go back and sort of look at what you were thinking at a various point in your life, but it can really help when you're struggling with stuff like this. And as I mentioned, I have a really small team. especially given the work that we're doing, it's hard. And Rachel, my co-founder, and I, we really try to live what we teach, because what kind of hypocrites would we be if we didn't practice what we preach? And so, we talk and we teach and train about having difficult conversations. And so we probably more so than other startup founders or other people working at companies really dive into some of these hard, difficult topics and conversations. And we're very similar, but we're also really different in certain ways. And so, like, sometimes I'm just like, I have to process what's going on. And I know that tomorrow I will feel differently, but right now I'm feeling this. And so how can I get it out so it's not destructive and it's not going to derail my relationship and it's not going to take away from the work that I have to get done. So journaling has been really effective. And this is also another thing which may not be relevant for everybody, but I like to draw. And so I draw cartoons about things that happen in my life. They're mostly private, so I don't really like spread them out to the world, but I sort of draw about what's going on. And sometimes it's very literal and sometimes it's a little bit more, metaphorical, but that also is really helpful because somehow that act of kind of putting it from my head onto paper, whether it's writing or drawing, art, helps me kind of like put it out there and then let it sit, and it's no longer consuming me inside. So that's a couple things that I've done to help deal with that.
I couldn't agree more. For me, journaling, and I try to journal like in the moment too. So, I mean, I'll journal in the evening, but if something feels triggering for me, going back to Celia's question, because she asked about how to deal with triggers. If something feels triggering for me, one thing I'm trying to get better at every single day is to stop right there and just like take notes on my phone. And I usually have a lot of insights that come up that help me reframe and shift from the destructive, self-sabotaging behavior of, oh my God, I'm horrible, like I'm just going to fail at everything, to like, wait a minute, things just went really well. And I'm going down this habit, because I think the negative thoughts we have, they're also a habit. Like we're used to feeling and thinking them. So reframing is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I will say too, to this idea or this point around triggering, for me, what I've seen happen is like certain ways of being, or there are certain phrases that can be really triggering for me that I've learned over time that are very triggering. And so especially if it's within my team, what we've started to do is we have what we call code words. And so if we're experiencing something that's really triggering, what we've learned is that over time, as we've had these conversations, is that usually the case is that the other person has no idea or doesn't intend it in the way that I or someone else is taking it. So we have like a code word that we'll actually, like let's say the code word is apple. So we'll like you and I will be having a conversation with Alba, and you'll say something and I'm like triggered and I'll be like apple, apple. And so that way, like, it sort of makes it like a funny joke. And so it kind of like diffuses some of the tension, even if it's only felt on one side.
Yeah.
And and then that way the other person like is aware that, I'm feeling something, and either we can kind of like talk about it, or we can just sort of like move on and just be like, okay, it wasn't meant that way, or we sort of deal with it in the moment that way.
Yeah.
So that's also been really helpful for me.
Well, yeah, because then you're also not keeping it in and it's not festering and turning into this whole issue. You're sharing it with your team and being open about it, which is really powerful. Awesome. So we have a couple minutes left. I don't want to keep everyone much longer. Thank you so much, everyone who's on Facebook Live. I see all the comments coming in. Leah, Eva, Eva says, oh my God, I love the drawing outlet. Leah is also an artist. I know that resonates with her. And thank you so much for everyone who's joining. Felicia, how can we find She Geeks Out? And you have a Galentine's event coming up.
Yeah,
I'd love to share that.
We are shegeeksout.com for our website, and then we're on all the social media platforms at She Geeks Out. If you're based in Boston, New York, or San Francisco, we, as I said, have events every month. We do have a Galentine's event coming up in New York that still has some tickets open for the 12th of February. And I think there's a special Work Bigger code that I think Belma can out to everybody. So check that out if you're around. I will say the New York Galentine's, it's actually Galentine's Plus event. And so it's open to all genders. So anyone is welcome to attend. It's not just for women only. And we have some sold out events in Boston and San Francisco for January, but we've got a bunch of stuff coming up for the next couple months in all 3 cities. So definitely check that out.
Awesome. I just shared the link that you sent me for the Eventbrite with our group here. What I'm going to do, everyone, too, I'm going to send out the recording. It's going to be on the Work Bigger website, workbigger.co. I'm going to include this event link. We also have some events for Work Bigger coming up. We have a workout class in Brooklyn this weekend, this Sunday. So I'll send that around. But yeah, thank you, Felicia, for just sharing so openly and just having this great conversation with us. I know it's so helpful for me too, just to hear about your perspective on DEI, imposter syndrome, women in tech. So I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a really great time. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.